No single man held more power in the world than the Tsar of Russia. But he was deposed by young visionaries who, instead of liberating their country, attempted to enslave the minds as well as the lives of millions of people and planned to rule the world. Ultimately, the falsehood of their ideology and the secret terrors of their system were exposed, not by an advancing army of superior strength, but by the force of truth declared in the writings of a courageous Russian author named Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn.
One word of truth shall outweigh the whole world. The Russian writer Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn echoed this eloquent Russian proverb in his 1974 Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. In Russia under communism, the truth had always been concealed. Solzhenitsyn changed this forever. By uncovering for his own people and the whole world true details of life in the Soviet Union, Solzhenitsyn undermined the legitimacy of communism as a moral system. He exposed the Soviet labor camp network, known as the Gulag, in such a way that even apologists of Soviet power were unable to continue defending it. Solzhenitsyn's life began only 1 year after the birth of communism itself.
As 1917 begins, no single man holds more power in the world than the Tsar of Russia. Nicholas II, with absolute power and answerable only to God, rules over 170 million people. He is a monarch committed to the past. He resists political change. But his days are numbered. Desperately hungry workers go on strike in St. Petersburg. On the Western Front, where the Tsar's huge armies have been fighting in the First World War for nearly 3 years, there is malcontent and talk of revolt. The armies have suffered defeat after defeat. 2 million have died. In February, the people revolt. The Tsar is arrested and abdicates. A provisional government takes charge. Most people anticipate free elections and a representative assembly. But the tiny Bolshevik party, with its charismatic leader Vladimir Lenin, wants something much more drastic. A state run by and for the working class, a dictatorship of the proletariat. With promises of ending the war, giving land to the peasants and power to the workers, Lenin stirs the people to further revolution. By autumn, he has the popular support he needs. On the night of October 25th, with the provisional government in session in the Tsar's former winter palace, Lenin makes his move. The Russian film director Sergei Eisenstein would later dramatize the event. In reality, the takeover involves only a handful of men and is quite uneventful. But Eisenstein's film version helps the communists to establish a key myth for the revolution of how the workers seized power. Lenin moves quickly. The Bolsheviks soon become known as the Russian Communist Party. Lenin moves the capital to Moscow. The Tsar and his family are executed. There will be no going back. On November the 11th, the Allies formally sign the armistice that ends World War I. A month later, on December the 11th, 1918, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn is born. His father has been killed in a tragic hunting accident only 6 months before he is born. Aleksandr will be raised by his mother, who will never remarry, and he will be lovingly cared for by his aunt and uncle, deeply committed Orthodox Christians. His aunt faithfully takes young Aleksandr to church. Here the boy absorbs the legacy of Orthodox Christianity that is an inseparable part of the Russian story. It is a legacy from which Solzhenitsyn, like the rest of Russia, will try to escape.
Solzhenitsyn was born into a family of landowners. He was christened, taken to church frequently as a small child. But by the early 20s, you have to remember that the revolution was firmly in place. And by the time Solzhenitsyn went to school, he was going to school already in a Soviet system. That system was atheist.
Some have speculated that communism was doomed from the beginning. To take God out of Russia was tantamount to taking Russia out of its own history. The two are inseparable, and they began almost at the same time, here in Kiev, the mother of Russian cities. Rus was the original name for the Orthodox Christian civilization of the Eastern Slavs, and it became the first name for Russia. Vladimir I led the conversion of the Eastern Slavs to Christianity in 988 here in Kiev. The cathedral they built was filled with shimmering Byzantine-style mosaics. In the 13th century, Mongol armies lay waste to Kiev and the surrounding countryside, and most of its churches are destroyed. When 250 years later the Russians repel the Mongol hordes, the only legacy left behind is a taste for war, money, and monetary tribute. The new rulers, the Russian czars, replicate their despotic dictatorship, building the largest land empire in human history, crossing 11 time zones, taking their Orthodox faith with them, but suppressing the peoples they conquer in poverty and ignorance. 2/3 of the people are little more than slaves. They are the property of aristocratic landowners who in turn owe their allegiance to an all-powerful czar living in palaces of unparalleled splendor. But beneath their oppression, the people embrace their Orthodox Christian faith, their one hope for an eternal future beyond their suffering. Lenin and the communists see the church as the last bastion of power to destroy in their quest for complete domination of the minds and hearts of the Russian people.
Solzhenitsyn very quickly turned his back on the faith of his parents and aunts and grandparents and became a typical product of the Soviet regime. He was a young, militant communist and an avowed atheist.
Юные ленинцы, до борьбы за справу Ленина, Сталина, будьте готовы!
The young pioneers become the training ground for a new generation of loyal communists. In a striking memory, Solzhenitsyn recalls the day young pioneer zealots ripped from his neck the tiny cross he'd worn all his life. But soon he too is a believer in the new order.
Solzhenitsyn was also a young pioneer, that is the equivalent of the Soviet Boy Scout, which means that he had to excel in his ability to what shall I say, not only to espouse the Soviet belief system, but to be a leader in it and to set an example.
1924 begins with the death of Lenin on January 21st. Communism has a new deity, and his name is Joseph Stalin. That year, Solzhenitsyn, now 6, joins his mother in Rostov on the Don River. She's gone there earlier to find work for their struggling family. They live in a tiny shack at the end of a street. But Aleksandr loves the city and he excels in school in every subject. At 12, he joins the Young Pioneers, by now a devoted believer in communism. Stalin is set on the elimination of any force of power other than his own, and he sees the church as his archenemy. In December, Stalin launches his campaign of terror against the Russian Orthodox Church. In the heart of Moscow stands the magnificent Church of Christ the Savior. It took most of the 19th century to build this great church. It takes Stalin only minutes to blow it up. This is only the beginning of Stalin's cultural terrorism. He orders the destruction of thousands of churches across Russia. Steeples are thrown down. Bells are toppled. Ancient icons are ripped from the walls and burned. In 1928, Stalin begins the systematic elimination of all private business. In 1929, he collectivizes the farms, taking over ownership of all land and everything on it. The farmers revolt, slaughtering more than half of the nation's livestock, rather than surrender it to Stalin. The country faces a devastating famine. Stalin retaliates and imprisons or exiles millions. He becomes obsessed with the fear of losing power. Quotas are set up for each region, one for exile, another for execution. Millions of innocent Russians die. In 1936, Solzhenitsyn graduates from high school with honors. His admission to the prestigious Rostov University is assured. He's already convinced he will someday be a writer.
Solzhenitsyn from a very early age saw writing as a vocation, and he told his first wife, I think even before they were married, that he saw writing as his vocation. But of course the sort of writer that he wanted to be was very different from the writer that he became because of subsequent events.
He realized that his love of literature could actually get him into trouble, because some of the authors that he liked, Dostoevsky for instance, were on the Soviet index. They were not approved of or republished. And he, being extremely talented in the sciences as well, he decided that it would be better if he pursued math and physics as a way of building a career.
At Rostov University, Solzhenitsyn becomes close friends with Nicholas Vukeyevich, with whom he spends hours discussing politics and their shared disdain for Stalin, who both feel has compromised the noble principles of Marx and Lenin. His first year at the university, Aleksandr meets Natalia Reshtevskaya, fellow student and a gifted pianist. They are married in a civil ceremony in the Rostov City Registry Office. That same year, Stalin invades the Baltics, adding the nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to the Soviet constellation. The next spring, on June 22, 1941, Hitler breaks his treaty with Stalin and invades Russia. By October, Hitler's war machine is advancing almost unchecked toward Moscow itself. Before they are stopped, the Nazis are within 10 miles of the city. Stalin orders out every able-bodied man who is not already on the front. Solzhenitsyn is eager to be part of the army defending the motherland. He manages to convince his commanders that his grasp of mathematics qualifies him for artillery duty. After a hurried course of study, Aleksandr is given the rank of second lieutenant and dispatched to the front. In July and August 1943, Solzhenitsyn takes part in the defense of Kursk. He receives the Order of the Patriotic War for his bravery on the field of battle. In his spare time, he corresponds with his college friend Nicholas Vukeyevich. In their letters, both men share their disdain for Stalin, whom they blame for corrupting the true vision of Lenin for a socialist utopia. Their letters will prove to be their undoing. January 1945. The war has turned against the Nazis. Russia and the Western Allies are preparing for their final advance on the heart of Germany. On the morning of February 9th, Aleksandr is told to report to the general's office near the front. When he arrives, to his surprise, he is greeted by officers of Stalin's secret police. He is under arrest. He has no idea why.
Solzhenitsyn was arrested on the basis of some correspondence that he had with his childhood, or rather his school friend, Nicholas Vukeyevich, and they were both, again, they were both Marxists, but they thought that Stalin was taking the wrong path, that he was not socialist enough, and so they exchanged views on this, and they talked about the revolution after the revolution, which would be the one that they were interested in. And this was the basis on which they were arrested.
Aleksandr is marched for 2 days across 45 miles to the nearest railway station, or he boards a train with other prisoners. The train winds its way across the frozen landscape of the cold Russian winter, back to Moscow, back to the dreaded Lubyanka prison in the bowels of KGB headquarters. Solzhenitsyn's long ordeal begins in the Russian network of prisons that will become known as the Gulag Archipelago. He is repeatedly ordered to strip naked for body searches. He is shaved of all body hair. Interrogations are ordered at all hours of the day or night. No torture is out of bounds if it will wring a confession. Sleep deprivation treatments are often used to extract confessions. Deprived of sleep, a man will finally say almost anything, confess to almost any crime, just to be allowed to sleep, not realizing that the confession instantly seals their fate, usually prescribed as 10 years of exiled hard labor, or in some cases, immediate execution. There is no court of appeal.
After Solzhenitsyn was arrested, he wrote several letters pleading for, mercy would be too strong a word, but pleading to have his case reinvestigated. And it was only after these were rejected and his first steps in the Gulag that he began to understand the true nature of that revolution that he thought he knew about and thought he loved, and to realize that this was a pitiless regime that probably would not even read his petitions, let alone act on them.
Aleksandr learns that his seditious writings will cost him the next 8 years. By Stalin's standards, it is a light sentence. Solzhenitsyn is repeatedly transferred from one prison to another, where he meets all kinds of prisoners, though very few would be considered criminals anywhere else. Many are doctors, lawyers, teachers, priests, scientists, professional people of all kinds, anyone with the courage or indiscretion to speak the truth.
He met more and more prisoners in the Gulag, more and more men, many of them much older than he was, with vast experience of life outside the Gulag and then particularly of life inside. He began to piece together some kind of picture of what was happening around him.
Spring 1946. A world away in the United States, Britain's wartime hero Winston Churchill pays a visit and makes a speech carried live on radio to the American public. It is a warning and a wake-up call to the West. In it, he mentions something called an Iron Curtain.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe.
Behind that Iron Curtain, despite the harsh conditions of their own lives, Russians are constantly fed messages of admiration and love for the leader of the communist world, the reigning deity of socialism, Joseph Stalin. There is not much singing in the bowels of the Russian Gulag, but there are rumors that the Soviets have constructed special prisons for scientists to work on research projects. They are called sharoskas, and living conditions are reportedly better. Solzhenitsyn fills out a form listing his occupation as atomic physicist. The lie works. In July 1946, he is assigned to the sharoska at Marfino. The prison is actually housed in a former seminary, across the street from a vast park in the heart of Moscow. The rumors were true. It is better here. Solzhenitsyn knows enough to be useful. His lie is never found out. Marfino tests his philosophical loyalties. Slowly, Solzhenitsyn begins to change on the inside.
In the first circle, he describes his conversations with the prisoners in the special scientific institute that he worked in. There was Kopylev, Solzhenitsyn, and Dmitry Panin. Now, of the three, Kopylev was the kind of man who believed in socialism with a human face. Panin was already a Christian on his way to becoming a Roman Catholic, who believed that socialism was the work of the devil. And Solzhenitsyn, both in the novel and I think in real life, was traveling from one position to the other. And I think he charted his way in terms of these two poles, if you like, of belief. And clearly he was traveling away from Kopylev's belief in socialism with a human face towards Panin's religious faith.
Solzhenitsyn will later describe his change. I began to move ever so slowly toward a position that was idealist, supporting the primacy of the spiritual over the material, and secondly, patriotic and religious. In other words, I began to return slowly and gradually to all my former childhood views. In 1947 and 48, Natalia is permitted 3 visits to her husband. She tells Aleksandr that the company where she works has been declared classified by the Soviets. Background checks on all the employees are bound to reveal their marriage. She would most certainly lose her job, and they are hard to come by these days. She proposes a divorce, so she can write unmarried on the forms. Solzhenitsyn is hurt, but he accepts. Natalia ultimately gets fired anyway on some other security pretext. Solzhenitsyn and his colleagues have it better than most prisoners because Stalin needs them. He is desperate to reach military parity with the West. In September 1949, the weapon he wants most, he finally gets. The Soviet Union is now a viable threat to the West. The Cold War is heating up. The communists will invest as much as 70% of their annual budget on military defense at the expense of everything else. It will make them a superpower, but it will ultimately destroy the empire. For now, there is more good news. China has fallen to the communists. The Soviet propaganda machine wastes no time in trumpeting the inevitability of world domination.
Теперь на 1/4 земного шара возникло могучее содружество народов социалистических стран. Теперь каждый 3-й человек живет и трудится при социализме. Теперь нас больше миллиарда.
Beneath the surface image of a contented and progressive Soviet empire, millions continued to live in abject poverty and ignorance. Stalin's purges of his enemies is unrelenting, though now carried out in secret. In May 1950, Solzhenitsyn's increasing attitude of indifference to his jailers results in his removal from the Sharashka. He is reassigned to Siberia. The Siberian plain is vast, much of it barren and subject to the whims of nature's harshest cruelties, the perfect setting for the most austere and cruel of Stalin's concentration camp system. Millions of innocent Russians are enslaved here. Most do not survive the ordeal. Sentences are often extended for petty reasons to make sure they never come back.
It's difficult for us to imagine exactly how awful the Gulag would have been at the time of Solzhenitsyn's arrest at the end of the Second World War. We have him to thank, of course, for a lot of the realistic pictures of it, but depictions of cold and depictions of hunger and depictions of brutality.
Within Solzhenitsyn now burns the fire of a visionary. He feels he has a mandate to tell the story of Russia's tragedy in the 20th century, to expose the lie of communism. To write down his thoughts would be to sign his own death warrant. Instead, he memorizes hundreds upon hundreds of pages of text, the countless stories of other prisoners, many of whom have already died in this place of hell. To those who tell him their tales of suffering, Solzhenitsyn feels he has a debt to repay their trust that he will expose the truth. On February the 9th, 1953, 8 years to the day since that fateful morning on the Russian front when he was arrested, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn is released from prison. He will later reflect on his survival in the labor camps of Stalin's terror.
This miracle I ascribe to both my religious faith and to the conscious understanding of my life's work, which I had to finish, and which was a spring pushing me. But I feel, in my understanding of my task, I could not die without finishing this.
But Aleksandr is not released from the Soviet tentacles of power. He must remain in this remote part of the empire and is not permitted to travel.
When he is released, first for internal exile in Kazakhstan, is another very earth-shaking experience for Solzhenitsyn. He survives cancer, and that book, Cancer Ward, is about that. He is released, he starts writing.
By day, Solzhenitsyn teaches mathematics in a local school. By night, and in every waking hour he is alone, the once devoted follower of Lenin now labors over the manuscripts that will someday tell the world of his own suffering and that of countless others. He is determined to repay his debt to their memory. On March the 6th, 1953, Joseph Stalin dies. His ambitions and fears have shaped Soviet man. His legacy will cast a long shadow. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, charts a different course. In February 1956, Khrushchev delivers what will be later called his secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. In it, he firmly denounces the crimes of Joseph Stalin. The speech sets the stage for a declaration of amnesty for millions of former prisoners. Solzhenitsyn is now free to live anywhere in the country. As Aleksandr continues his public job as a math and physics teacher, his writing takes on a new urgency. He completes drafts of several future works, but it is the semi-autobiographical story of a single day in the life of a Gulag prisoner in a labor camp in Siberia that is destined to change Solzhenitsyn's life and begin his public war against the Soviet Empire. It will ultimately be called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. The manuscript is finished in 1959, but Aleksandr keeps it a secret. The Soviet Union is undergoing tremendous ferment and change, but change is not what the communist leaders want. Since World War II, they have effectively maintained a barrier to the West and its decadent influence, except in one place. East and West Berlin remain a haven for the exchange of ideas and cultures. People freely move from one side to the other. On August 13, 1961, that changes. Overnight, the border is closed, first by armed guard, then barbed wire, and finally by an imposing brick wall. Thousands try to escape in the first weeks, their images on Western television only adding to the conviction of many that the Soviet Union is the archenemy of freedom. That December, a trusted friend takes Solzhenitsyn's one-day manuscript to the one publisher they think might have the courage to print it. But will they?
I think when Solzhenitsyn completed it, he didn't think it would be published, because it, after all, was the story, it was the unvarnished story of a simple prisoner in the Gulag, which showed all the harshness and the cruelties. A lot of them were implied, but any Russian, any Soviet Russian reader could read between the lines and understand what was going on. He sent it to his old friend Lev Kopylev to begin with, just to read, and it was Kopylev who took it off to Novy Mir and to Aleksandr Tvardovsky, the editor, and who managed to get it, with someone's help, onto Tvardovsky's desk. Tvardovsky himself didn't think he would get it published, and he took it. He had, I don't know if you know this story, he had, I forget the exact number, but something like 26 copies of Ivan Denisovich run off the presses as one of the most exclusive editions that's ever been done in Russia, and took them to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev put them on the desks of members of the Politburo and had them read it. Many of them protested. Many of them said, this is disgusting, this is treasonous, we can't publish this. But Khrushchev himself wanted to publish it. Some of his more liberal colleagues wanted to publish it, and Khrushchev just about bulldozed it through. got back to Twardowski and said, you have permission. When it came out, I talked to people afterwards. The moment it hit the streets, it was gone in an instant.
Those that were loyal to communism were outraged at the suggestion, that communism could be depicted in such a brutal way. But of course, many others, and not least those that had suffered in the Gulag, were absolutely had a sense of elation and liberation that someone had actually given testimony to this sort of suffering that had gone on, sort of hidden under the carpet of Stalinism.
The brilliance of that little book, which really taught you the infinite texture of hope, what it meant to those Gulag prisoners to look forward to one extra ounce of bread on a good day, and what it meant to feel just a little bit warmer under certain circumstances at night. It cast a light on the possibility of hope for people who were suffering as so many did.
It creates a sensation in Russia. People borrow the journal one from another and read it at night just to pass it on to the next one.
What he was an absolutely uncompromising voice. As pointed out in this book, his great muse was truth. Always tell all the truth.
Freedom is not to grab and take as much as possible from neighbors or from somebody else. Feelings have been given us for freedom. But God gave us freedom of choice. Before my exile, I wrote that freedom consists of being able to act and to think independently from external pressures and external enemies. That is freedom. In the Gospel it says, understand truth, and truth will make you free. This is fascinating, outstanding. What does this mean? It means the path to freedom lies not in the fact that the Parliament made a law of greater freedom today.
There was a feeling that at last Russia was going to open up, that the Soviet Union was going to liberalize itself, that the Communist Party was going to at least loosen the reins somewhat. But as we now know, it turned out to be Khrushchev's undoing, because the reaction this time was so strong among the official party members, and particularly their leaders, that Khrushchev himself was ousted from power.
By 1963, royalties from one day enabled Solzhenitsyn to become a full-time writer. He is granted membership in the exclusive Soviet Writers' Union. But in the inner circles of power, the Solzhenitsyn star has already started to fall. Permission to publish his expansive autobiography, The First Circle, is denied. His publisher refuses his novel Cancer Ward, convinced by now that the writer is less of a literary asset and more a political liability. Secretly, he is writing feverishly on a new manuscript. It will reach 1,500 pages. It is Solzhenitsyn's searing indictment of the entire Soviet system. It is called the Gulag Archipelago.
Former prisoners from all over the Soviet Union began sending him their stories. Some of them were well-written works, some of them were amateurish reminiscences. And Solzhenitsyn reached the conclusion that it was his duty to gather these things and put them into print.
In 1968, Aleksandr falls in love with a young graduate student from Moscow University who has become one of his trusted aides in researching and copying his manuscripts. Natalia Sverdlova is charming, brilliant, athletic, and feisty. They will marry in 5 years and raise a family. In 1968, the overseas publication of The First Circle and Cancer Ward causes a firestorm among the Soviet literary establishment. The next year, Solzhenitsyn is expelled from the Soviet Writers' Union. Ironically, 1 year later, on October the 8th, 1970, he is notified that he has won the Nobel Prize for Literature. But fearing he would not be allowed back in the country, he does not attend the award ceremony. Then in September 1973, the KGB arrests one of Solzhenitsyn's trusted copyists, who breaks down under pressure to reveal the hiding place of a copy of the Gulag Archipelago. Once in their hands, its searing indictment of Soviet totalitarianism seals Aleksandr's fate. Meanwhile, he has already given permission for its publication overseas. By December, it is on the streets of New York and London and causing an international sensation.
Solzhenitsyn blew sky high the idea that everyone in the Soviet Union agrees to the party line.
Solzhenitsyn was a threat at this point because, first of all, he was one of the only people willing to speak out, and speak out at the risk of his own life, not to speak of liberty. And I think the Politburo, as we now know from the discussions that they held, feared that an opposition would coalesce around Solzhenitsyn, a political opposition, and that if they jailed him, he would become a martyr.
They were afraid of him. They got to the point that they knew, the top leadership knew, that the man is telling the truth, they're telling the lies, and if they kill him, or if they incarcerate him for a lengthy period of time, this will be an admission of guilt on their part. And they were interested in détente with the West at the time.
Brezhnev holds secret meetings in the Kremlin. Solzhenitsyn must be removed from the Soviet public. He will be exiled to the first country who agrees to take him. Germany lets it be known they will welcome the writer if he is expelled from his homeland. On February the 12th, 1974, KGB officers burst into the Solzhenitsyn apartment in Moscow. He is arrested, taken to the same prison where he began his incarceration years before. He is stripped, searched, and the next morning dressed in a suit and taken to an awaiting Aeroflot plane, departing for Frankfurt. A month later, he is joined by the rest of his family. He finally settles in the United States, in a comfortable home in rural Vermont, where from 6 in the morning till 9 o'clock at night he writes, 7 days a week without stopping. He is working on his ultimate literary masterpiece, his epic of 20th century Russia that he had dreamed of writing as a teenager, The Red Wheel.
Solzhenitsyn gets out. He now can publish not just his novels, not just the First Circle and Cancer World Award. He can publish Gulag. And I credit Gulag being that bomb, being the dynamite that blew away the ideological justification for that system.
In 1978, he delivers the commencement address at Harvard University. He denounces what he considers to be the self-centered and indulgent economic greed, moral confusion, and spiritual depravity of the West.
We Americans applauded enthusiastically his speaking truth to power in the Soviet Union. Yes, it was truth as he saw it. It was his truth. But what guts it took to do what he did there. So we applauded him greatly. But then when he gave the Harvard speech, in which he sought to speak his version of truth to power in this country, yes, again, his truth, his version of it, but he had the courage to stand tall, look us in the eye, and say, this is what I think the truth is, what I really think it is. Well, you could hear the air go out of the Solzhenitsyn balloon in the United States. But I think that was followed by a rebuilding of Solzhenitsyn's reputation in this country. I know as a reporter that frequently your first impressions are the most valid impressions. And Solzhenitsyn was new, still new to our country. And he was giving fresh impressions of a very intelligent, thoughtful person coming from afar. And so after the first indignation and how dare he, I began to think about it and realize that in many important ways he was right.
Solzhenitsyn openly declares that he believes he will return to Russia in his own lifetime. No one believes him. In the face of the recent fall of Vietnam and Indochina to communism, and the seemingly increasing power of the Soviet Union, it seems an absurd assertion. Throughout the republics, the Soviet world remains a world of mass illusion in which the individual is inseparable from the whole, and no one has meaning on their own. But the Soviet world is about to change. 3 leaders from the old guard die in quick succession: Brezhnev in '82, Andropov in '84, Chernenko in '85. They are replaced by a leader from a new generation who seems to understand. Mikhail Gorbachev declares the Soviet world can only be transformed with the full participation of the people.
Хотим, чтобы так у нас шло в стране, чтобы люди наши активно принимали участие во всех делах, которые касаются и коллектива, и страны.
Gorbachev envisions an enlightened communist world. Others have a different view of the future. Copies of Solzhenitsyn's works smuggled back into the country and excerpts broadcast over Radio Free Europe are helping to stir the undercurrent of yearning for freedom within Russia and the republics. In 1988, there is ethnic unrest in the Baltic republics. In Hungary, new leaders began to dismantle the old political system, even allowing people to take down sections of the Iron Curtain. In 1989, the Catholic-supported Solidarity movement in Poland forces the government to hold free elections, ousting the communists from power. In October, East Germans demonstrate to be free from the wall. It comes down and the city is once again whole. In December, Bucharest explodes in a revolt against the communist dictator Ceausescu. When the army deserts him, he and his wife flee the city. In March 1990, Lithuania declares its independence from the Soviet Union. The hardliner communists have had enough. On August the 18th, 1991, they attempt to overthrow the Gorbachev government and replace it with an old-style Soviet power.
Мы имеем дело с правым реакционным антиконституционным переворотом.
The coup backfires, largely because of a popular politician named Boris Yeltsin, who calls for the people to let their will be known. They do, and the communists step down. In August, Gorbachev resigns as head of the Communist Party. On December 25th, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is dissolved. The hammer and sickle flag is lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. In its place rises the white, blue, and red banner of the Russian Federation.
That communism in Russia would end, I was convinced after my first years in jail in 1945 through 46. I met so many people in the camps there. They made it obvious to me that communism was doomed.
By now, the charges that once caused Solzhenitsyn's expulsion have been dismissed and the sentence of exile rescinded. It is time for Russia's greatest living author to come home. He does. Ultimately, how will Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn be remembered? What will be his legacy?
When one thinks of Solzhenitsyn, you think of stoicism, courage, willfulness, and a man who made a tremendous effort to be a truth speaker.
I believe Solzhenitsyn's contribution to Russian literature in the 20th century and to the politics of Russia through literature is greater than the rest of the Russian literature combined.
I thought him a truly august figure because he he reminded the whole world that there was no excusing what the Soviet Union was doing.
Solzhenitsyn played a role in the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union because what really brought about that collapse was that it rotted from within. And it rotted in a number of ways. Clearly, it rotted in terms of its own services to its population, its own inability to meet the needs of the people, but it rotted in terms of its legitimacy as well.
Solzhenitsyn does think that his one-man struggle, heroically conducted, was influential on undermining the Soviet regime.
What he did was almost single-handedly penetrate and repel and forever discredit the French intelligentsia who continued to defend the Soviet Union.
Solzhenitsyn helped vastly to undermine the legitimacy of the communist idea from within. And I think it was all the more stronger because he had once believed.
It is almost impossible to imagine the miracle that took place in the Soviet Union in 1991. The miracle that Solzhenitsyn helped to make happen. The greatest empire of the Eastern Hemisphere was thrown down. Its despotic rulers replaced with those who stood for the rights and dreams of the people. There were others who helped to make this miracle possible, but there is no doubt that the voice of truth from this one man proved more powerful than all the military might of the Soviet Empire. All over the Soviet Union, people tore down the symbols of an ideology that had shaped so much of the 20th century, and they put their hope in new ideas and in the power of the individual over the might of the whole. It remains for a new generation to arise to make those ideas ultimately succeed. A young boy stands fishing on the shore of the Don River in Rostov, looking and acting a lot like Solzhenitsyn did at his age in this very same place. What will this boy become? What achievements, great or personal, will he accomplish? Who can say? Because of another young man who once stood on this shore and his courage to tell the truth as he saw it to his generation, this boy will be free to write his own future. Indeed, all of Russia will be free to write a new chapter in its history.
I once asked Solzhenitsyn if he believed he had lived out his life's purpose. Without hesitation, he replied, "At the end of my life, I will have fulfilled my debt." What debt did he mean? Solzhenitsyn believed he owed something incalculable to the victims of communism who had risked their lives by telling him what they knew. Today, back home in a very different Russia, Solzhenitsyn's vision of a healthy society remains centered on his conviction about the foundational nature of truth. Such truth-telling courage in the face of both government dictatorship in the East and the dictatorship of cultural fashion in the West confirms Solzhenitsyn's stature as a great soul.